Oscar Combs here, and I want to put one rumor to rest, once and for all. The story is that Rafferty's goes all out for sports fans, and let me tell you, it's absolutely true. Confirmed. And fans love Rafferty's right back because the food is so terrific. Served fresh, served fast, served friendly, lunch or dinner. Rafferty's menu is jam-packed with all your favorites. Steaks, prime rib, chicken, ribs, delicious dishes in generous sizes that really satisfy the appetite. So come hang with the sports crowd at Rafferty's. It's the tastiest place in town.
Big Blue Nation, welcome to Conversations with Oscar Combs as we continue to give University of Kentucky fans a unique look at Kentucky basketball and football. Ralph Hacker had the enormous task of following a legend much like Joby Hall. However, it wasn't on the court or on the field. It was behind the microphone. Ralph Hacker, alongside Kaywood Ledford, was instrumental in conveying the action from the Wildcats to your radio. Oscar sat down with Ralph Hacker over the summer for a three-part series, and we've decided to share that with you, starting with Kentucky football. Ralph will describe his early days in Madison County, growing up and watching football and following the Cats. How much of a legend was the late Babe Pirelli? Ralph's going to tell you. And we'll get his thoughts on giving credit where credit is due during radio broadcasts. You will hear stories on some of the past UK football coaches, including Charlie Bradshaw, John Ray, and Hal Mummy. And how crazy is Ralph Hacker? Crazy enough to put a bug in Larry Ivy's ear about a certain head coach at Alabama. Ralph will tell us who's responsible for the construction of Commonwealth Stadium. That's right, I said it, Commonwealth Stadium. There's quite a bit of outstanding insight to Kentucky football history that you're not going to get it anywhere else. I'm Bo Robinson, and you're listening to part one of Conversations with Oscar Combs and his guest, Ralph Hacker.
Ralph, first of all, congratulations. Just going into the UK Hall of Fame, big surprise, I guess?
Total surprise. I never thought about it. I honestly never thought it would ever occur, never thought about being a member of a Hall of Fame whatsoever, the University of Kentucky Hall of Fame. I'm just an old country boy from over in Madison County.
When you become a football fan?
When did I become a fan?
Yeah.
We could understand when I went to high school, we didn't have football. We had track, baseball, and basketball. I played basketball. I played baseball. I never ran track. A little like Carl Hurley. I played they'd tell me to get out there and, start running, turn left, and get back as soon as I could. But I never ran track, and we didn't have football. So what we did have was the Madison High Madison Model Royal Purples. and Jerry Woolham played quarterback there.
Who later came to Kentucky.
And that's when I started watching football, was when Jerry Woolham was in high school.
Which would have been?
Oh, that would have been, about 19 and
late 50s?
57, 58, somewhere in that ballpark, in that era. And then when I went to Madison Central, since we didn't have the football team, on Friday nights we would go watch Madison play and cheer for Madison High. Talbot Todd, Freddie Ballou, Sonny West, James Bosley, Johnny Collins, all these guys were out there playing. David Rivers, Dale Carrier, all these guys would play, and we would cheer for them. So that's when I started following football, was in high school then. Unfortunately, we didn't have it. All right, I think I could have. I probably would have tried to have played. I was big enough. I was 6'2" at that time. I was 6'2" as a freshman in high school and weighed 155 pounds or something like that.
Were you a college fan at the time, or when did you start following
Eastern.
college?
Eastern, and then when Jerry came to the University of Kentucky, we would, and always I listened to the ball games, but I listened to them with Claude Sullivan, doing the ball games, back into the 50s. But when Jerry came to the University of Kentucky, I started following it a lot closer up there.
At what point, or did you go back and study and know what you know today about the Bear Bryant era, particularly in the 48, 49, 50? Pt.1.
Oh, probably.
With Pirelli and Blanda. And
Well, probably once when I got here. See, I grew up being because of being there. We'd go to Eastern games. Coach Bresnell was coaching there. Roy Kidd was an assistant coach there, but he was a head coach at Madison High School when I first started watching that. So I would go up and watch Eastern's games as a kid, and then, like I say, listen to Kentucky's games. I got to know an awful lot of the players from back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And I always prided myself that there were very, very few of the basketball players that ever played at the University of Kentucky I hadn't met. Not to say that I met 100% of them. But I probably met 90% of the players that were alive in my career over here. I met and got to know in some respect through that point. Ralph Beard and I became friends.
I remember, in fact, you gave me a picture of the Fab Five that you had made with Joe B. and Harry Lancaster, and had them all autographed and everything, and you'd had some kind of a function with them.
Yeah, and it just, I think that once you're gone from the University of Kentucky, and it's not just UK, it's every place, you're forgotten. I mean, you're about a 4-year span, and at the most, and your history. But I always said I'm not going to let that happen. And it's like when broadcasting the football games, you get a lot of complaints because I tried to give the lineman credit. But I'll never forget a mother of a lineman came to me, or two mothers, both boys were from Louisville, great big good linemen, came to me one time and said, if it weren't for you, nobody would ever known our boys played at the University of Kentucky. And I kind of took that to heart. So I want to give all these guys who, weren't the guys getting their names in the papers every day, that sort of thing. So, and the same thing, Oscar, with the old players. I want to get to know them. The night before Babe Pirelli died, I received a phone call. It says, Babe has talked about you so much lately. He would want you to know that he is passing. And I thought, well, how sweet is that? And I got to know Babe Pirelli late in his life. I probably got to know Babe Pirelli 20 years ago. And I love Babe Pirelli.
He always came by. The last several years, he'd come into Lexington State twice a year.
Yeah.
Usually during Keeneland and football.
Right.
And he would always come to Wheeler's in the morning for breakfast and meet people. And just such a genuine, you'd never know, that's Babe Pirelli there?
One of the great thrills I had was he'd come to Florida in the wintertime. And they'd always call me, let me know he was coming, and I'd go get him, or he'd come to the house, or we'd meet, and I'd take him to play golf, and we'd take him to eat. And I introduced him. One day I walked in, and down in Vero Beach, Florida, all these people are crazy Florida fans. And I walked in there, all they talk about is football. And I walked up to a group of them one time, and one of them happened to be the roommate of Steve Spurrier at the University of Florida. And I said, boys, who's the greatest quarterback of the 1950s in the Southeastern Conference? They stood there, and one of them blurted out, Babe Pirelli. And they all agreed, Babe Pirelli. I said, let me introduce you to Vito Babe Pirelli. And they went crazy.
Yeah.
That night, we go out to dinner, and we're standing there and waiting for a table, standing at the bar, and Babe was having a beer, and this guy walked in and spoke to me, and we talked for a few minutes, and I got the privilege of introducing Babe Pirelli to Ron Peronowski, who I believe was the first relief pitcher in baseball.
Left-hander for
Left-hander,
Dodgers.
and played for the Dodgers and lives in Vero Beach, which I've gotten to know Ron Peronowski over the years. And that was one of the great, and turns out Peronowski was a few years younger than Babe. Loved Babe Pirelli because he was from up in Michigan and was a Green Bay fan.
That's one of the things I'm so happy about, what Mitch Barnhart in the UK is doing for Talbot Todd right now. He was sort of in the area, but suddenly the fans forget about you.
Yeah.
And nobody, your close friends do. But I'm happy to see that they've embraced him. They've done the honors for him while he could somewhat enjoy it. And I like what they're doing around the stadium and bringing these All-Americans back. I'd like for them to see them honoring some people that are not as well known. I mean, maybe have a wall of just different lettermen at different time, because people just don't understand, particularly when you start talking about the greatest player of all time, as you did a while ago. I can say this is the greatest Wildcat I ever saw play in my lifetime, but I can't say he's the greatest Wildcat when I wasn't even around in the 40s.
Yeah. How good was Paul McBrayer when he played for Coach Rupp?
Yes.
Nobody knows.
No.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows how good these players were back in their 30s or 40s. They really don't. You can't remember, except 2 years ago, 3 years ago, how good that team was. You think you can remember how good Macy was, but how many of you really saw him?
That's right. And the way our society is today, people move so much. I mean, there's so many people living in central Kentucky now that are maybe 50 years old, but they've only been living here 10 years or 15 years.
No question.
And they know nothing beyond that. When you started getting involved, you mentioned Charlie Bradshaw a while ago. Was that the first coach that you had interactions with?
At Kentucky?
At Kentucky?
Yes. He was the first one. And then the rest of them I interacted up. Didn't work with Hal Mummy, but I got to know Hal Mummy well and enjoyed Hal Mummy. Enjoyed immensely being around him. And the others I don't know at all.
Yeah. I guess is the end of the Charlie Bradshaw era. You pretty much got to know him. Did you know him the first 2 or 3 years, the Thin 30 and that crew?
No, that was when Talbot was there, and
Yes.
Talbot and I were the same age and all that. No, I did not know him. I knew a lot of the players. Roger Bird, Talbot, Sam Ball, obviously, and to go on for many of the
Well,
players.
as the story goes, UK brought in Charlie to sort of straighten everything out. Things had sort of gotten loose with the program. There wasn't a lot of discipline, and as legend has it, or as history has it, is the UK president called Bear Bryant and said, "I need somebody tough that can get us floating again." And he said, "Hey, I got an assistant here. It's a ex-Marine. He can straighten it up."
Well, I've heard that. I don't know that for a fact. I've heard that, and I know that he was one tough Marine, and he was one tough son of a gun, and he did everything that he could to straighten it up. And he told me the book that came out a few years ago, somebody said, "Have you read it?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "It's the same story as Charlie Bradshaw told me 25 years ago. Exactly the same stories." So I believe everything that was in the book.
So now, where were you at the point in time that John Ray was hired?
I was working WVLK.
VLK.
I was working there. Still, not.
And I was in Hazard at the time, but everything that we were told is, okay, now everything's in line because this guy comes from Notre Dame.
We believe
This
in you,
guy-
Big Blue.
Yes.
Right, that was his slogan.
Yeah.
And he brought that in. He had Caven Barnett, my old boss, in Richmond. Caven was over here working, and he got Caven involved in the Wildcat Club. And they came out. They got blue blazers, blue pants, ties. They were the first person to start marketing the University of Kentucky football. And they had these football meetings at the Campbell House, as I recall.
Yes, that is
Where we
correct.
held.
Usually on a Thursday night at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, they have them out there, and John or one of the coaches would come.
Yeah.
And
They made $100 on the side for appearing that night.
yeah, could be.
Yeah.
And so they'd come out there and they would speak and they'd do what they did. And I had hoped that John Ray would make it. John Ray was a defensive-minded coach, but he could just never get it all together here as far as getting the players together and all that.
But supposedly at the end of it is he's the one that got everybody excited enough to get the legislature and the governor, Louis Nunn at the time, to build a new stadium. And his last year here, he had 1 year left on his contract, and he asked the board to give him a 1 year extension where he would have 2 in the new stadium.
Oh.
They wouldn't give him the extra one, and he basically said, "Well, I'm leaving on this one."
Probably.
I mean, it seemed to me like he was biting his nose to spite his face here.
He was.
Kersey came in and won 5 games that first year.
He was a proud man. John Ray was a very proud man. I broadcast the last game in the Coliseum,
In the
first game in Rupp Arena. I broadcast the last one in Stall Field, first one in Commonwealth Stadium. I just happened, again, to be at the right place at the right time. Nothing I had to do with that. It's just the way that it turned out. There's a story that Governor Nunn told me many times, meaning maybe half a dozen, that when the group came to talk about the Commonwealth Stadium, he said they called him. I said, I guess it was Jim Host who set up the meeting. Jim was working for the governor at the time. And they came over there, and they sat down, and they started talking about this and wanted to know if he would support a bond issue for the Commonwealth Stadium. And he said, yes, I think I can do that. And they went over everything and where they wanted to put it and the size of it. He said, is there anything else you want to talk about? And they said, no. He said, how's the kind of basketball team we're going to have? We're going to have a good one. Anything else you want to talk about? No. And he said, I gave them every opportunity to ask me to build a gymnasium out there next to Commonwealth Stadium, and they never asked me.
You know, there's actually some plans that were made at that time that had this sort of like Notre Dame. They had a stadium and a round arena right next to it, but for some reason Singletary never acted on it.
Not done by the university. It was done by an outside group, who put that together. But said they never asked me to do that. So John Ray, I think in all reality, it was his promotion of the UK football program and the excitement that he caused by coming in here from Notre Dame, even though he wasn't a big winner, the excitement that he came in here that caused Commonwealth Stadium to eventually to be built.
Don't think there's any question. Kersey comes in, and he basically, John White Brown was very, very instrumental in him getting the job. First year, 5-6. I think it was the second game of the season. I can't remember. It was the first game they played Alabama. Had a 14-0 lead at the half. Mm-hmm. And a kick returner for Alabama ran off the second half kickoff for a 100-yard touchdown and ended up losing 28-14.
Right.
But everything looked so positive for the future.
Fran Kersey was, again, like so many coaches, an outstanding coach, and he could put together a staff. Fran Kersey had some outstanding coaches. John Ray had some great coaches that went on into like Ohio State, into Nebraska. They became professional coaches for a number of different professional teams. So John could put together a staff as well. Then when Fran came in, Fran put together a really good staff, and Fran could recruit. Fran went up east, and he recruited, and they apparently, I never knew what they did, apparently did some illegal things. But when you get a group in there like like Derek Ramsey and Warren Bryant and Art Still,
Jerry Blanton,
and all those guys, you get all those at one time, and you got a guy who can coach and a guy who can motivate, and you got a crowd who wants to win. You can do some stuff. And Fran was an outstanding coach.
Well, in '73 he had the 5 wins. '74, and you gotta tell me what you know here. Maybe you can share something you've never shared before. In that '75 season was supposed to be a takeoff season, but it went AWOL in the middle of the season with the Auburn game. This was Sonny Collins' senior season. He's told me many times if he had only come to UK 1 year later, and had he been on that '76 team, they could have really gone places. But how bad did that one weekend destroy the season against Auburn?
Was that
that was the weekend
when Sonny got hurt?
Well, I think it was after Sonny got hurt, but the big deal was the Elmore Stevens investigation for that death.
All right, where he and John Bishop and another young man.
Yeah.
They
started over at the library.
They had got this man, and for young, their age, and had tied him up, and had put, as I recall, and I don't know all the details, put a rope around his neck and around his feet, and struggling to get loose, the guy choked himself to death. That's what I always heard. Is the kind of knots that they had on,
Mm-hmm.
the guy choked himself to death in the back of this car, and that was that was terrible. That was you had Bubba McCullum was around there, and those guys, and it was Darrell Bishop, it was Darrell's cousin who was with him, and I'm trying to remember the young man's name, and I knew him, I knew the young man. And he wasn't a football player at all. But they got involved in some funny stuff. I don't know whether it was. I don't think it was drugs as it would be today. I don't think it was drugs. It was some other stuff that was involved, and the murder just changed everything. It just changed everything.
And a lot of people weren't very high on the next season to come along, but then everything fell in place in '76.
Right, it did for a fact, and that's where you had the great the guys from up east, the old Eastern connection. He's like bringing Pirelli and bringing Steve Meilinger and all those guys back in. You had great talent. You had great talent on one team. And I remember, they used to bring, sometimes on offense it'd be 5-6 yards to go. And Ramsey would be at quarterback. They'd bring, I guess it was Warren in and put him there next to Art Still, on the offensive line. And Derek Ramsey would look over to the star on the other side, and he'd say, number 71 or number 14 or whatever his name, we're coming over you. and they never failed. Yeah. Once they told you they were coming after you, you take those guys who were like, 6'7", 6'8", 300 pounds, round numbers, and they're all muscle. And Derek, who was 6'7", about 235, bang, they hit you. You were gone.
Going in the last game of the season, they're 6-4. You got to be at least 74 back then to make a bowl game because there weren't that many bowl games. They go to Knoxville, and they play for 4 quarters. At the end of it, a tip pass, Ramsey throws the pass, and the defensive back tips up, and I guess it's Kentucky gets it, runs it in for a touchdown. Nobody comes close to scoring. And before the game, the Peach Bowl people announced that both teams were 6-4, and the winner would get a Peach Bowl. And after the game, Kentucky got the Peach Bowl, and after the game, the AD came out and announced that Bill Battle had been fired.
They don't put up with losing at Tennessee, do they? In all reality, you're right about that. But let's look ahead. Let's jump ahead 30 years. Bill Battle.
He's made a lot of money.
Hey, Bill Battle was a lucky man.
Yes.
Right at that particular time.
And I think he was the youngest college coach in the country at the time he got the job.
Yeah, probably. But, again, I've always thought if they'd lost to Auburn, would they have fired him? He lost to Kentucky. And at that time, if you lost to Kentucky, people in football, people want to fire you. Mm-hmm. They want to get rid of you if you lost to Kentucky. Mm-hmm. It's like if Kentucky plays basketball and they lose to Auburn. You won't.
Well, I'll tell you what. If Kentucky beats Tennessee this year, that might be the day they fire Butch Jones.
It very well might be. But see, again, it's a stigma of Kentucky against that. Now, it'll take a few years winning, and I hope we get to there, that stigma will go away. But so far, that stigma is there.
So in '76, they have a very good year. They actually lose to Mississippi State, I think 14-7 down in Jackson. But it ends up they get credit and they have to force the game a year later. It gives them another year. They use an eligible player. But anyway, you fast forward and you're going to Atlanta for the Peach Bowl. I mean, of all the time I've been here, I don't think I've seen a crowd at any bowl game, except because, they hadn't been to one in, quarter century, since 52 or 53 to 76. And the night before the game, though, you and Kaywood are in Louisville doing a Kentucky-Notre Dame game.
I remember saying when we got through with the game, because there were so many people headed out, the last one in Kentucky, leaving Kentucky, turn off the lights. And we came back to Lexington, got on a charter flight, flew down there to Atlanta. One of the coldest days I've ever worked a football game in my life was there in Atlanta. It had been wet, and it was so dead burn cold, it was unbelievable.
Yeah, and they had no heat in a press box.
Right.
Atlanta Fulton County Stadium.
I thought if we played North Carolina, wasn't it?
Yes.
We played, yeah.
Yes, North
Carolina.
Beat them 21-0.
Yeah.
Rod Stewart had a phenomenal game, 3 touchdowns. Yeah. And that was before he blew his knee out next year against Baylor.
Yeah.
Next year against Baylor, you're 10-1, lose only to Baylor. Some people think that may be the best team in Kentucky history. Certainly going back to the team that won the Orange Bowl.
That would be hard to argue with that it was not the best team since the 1950s.
What do you remember most about that team?
Again, the guys I talked about a while ago. Again, they were so great. I'm still surprised they lost to Baylor, to be truthful with you. Another thing. What I remember in the end was the University of Kentucky, when all this stuff was all said and done, would not allow that team to have, even though they were declared the champions, would not allow them to have a ring. It was 20 years later that the team itself put up the money, had their own banquet, and bought the rings. And I remember that probably because they gave Kaywood and me one. They said, you're all as much part of the team as anybody.
I remember a great number of UK players, former players, were real upset a few years ago. I guess, let's see, the 77, it would have been probably 97. Yeah, it was 97, the 20th anniversary. And they wanted to have UK to have a 20th anniversary reunion, and CM wouldn't let them. And they just got through having a 02 10-year reunion of the Unforgettables. And a couple of our friends were in on the meeting. Joe Bright was one. You remember Joe? And they went in and they said, and Sim said, we'll never honor a team that was on probation. And one of them looked up to him and said, could you at least give us a parade downtown? And Sim said, what do you mean? He said, well, you gave the Unforgettables a parade downtown when the season ended and they were on probation. And that was sort of to this day, there's a lot of football people don't like Sam Newton's name on the football field. But beyond that, Kentucky, Kersey never has a season to match that. Some incidents that happened off the field, why they weren't major, but they were just things. And then John White sort of turned on Kersey. What do you remember about that?
I remember that he did, and he wanted to bring in former NFL coach, to be
George
Allen to be the head coach at the University of Kentucky. John White, being a University of Kentucky alumnus and governor, he was governor. Wanted to flex his muscle.
Well, he was the governor who put in the Kentucky-Louisville basketball series.
Oh, I understand. And remembered it was John White who flew Fran Kersey up here to get the job. And when they got off the plane, John White flew him up on their plane.
In December, they wanted to introduce him at a basketball game at the Coliseum.
Right. He got off, and Fran had on Florida clothing. And he was freezing to death, and John White gave him a top coat to wear.
Actually, an overcoat down to his ankles.
Yeah. To him, it would,
Yeah.
So I think it's cashmere. So he ends up.
And he doesn't give it back to him.
Well, that's the end of the story. So the last game there, Fran Kersey knew that it was his last game playing Tennessee. He walked out and he said to Johnny Majors as he shook his hand at the center stripe, said, "I'm gonna kick your ass," and walked off.
That's right.
So he looked up. Fran's got on this new hat. He's got on this top coat, a brand new suit, brand new shoes. Looks up there, and John Wiles up there with George Allen in the stands. He looks up, runs his fingers down the lapels to remind John why he still has his top coat on the thing. And he goes out and beats Tennessee.
I'm in the press box, though, an hour before the game that day, and Haywood Harris comes up that we talked about a while ago, and he said, well, we're not winning today. And I said, what do you mean, Haywood? And he said, no way. I said, what do you mean? He said, I just left the field. I said, Johnny's beside himself. I said, well, what are you talking about? He said, well, this morning at breakfast, he was all up in the air about, he didn't know what it's good, because he and Fran are really good friends. And he didn't know, he said just didn't know what to say. He knows it's his last game, he knows he's probably going to beat him pretty good. And he just real edgy. Said, you know what? Said he went in there an hour and a half before the game, and he sees Fran at midfield when coaches come and talk to each other, and they go their separate ways. Said he walks out there and he said, well, I just, do what I have to do. And says, Fran walks up to me and says, he just looks at me in the eye and says, Johnny, I'm going to beat your blank, blank, blank. And just turns around and walks off and doesn't say another word. And he said, Johnny come, he said, we're beat.
But Fran put together some great players, not just those guys for that particular year. He put some other players.
He had a number of players to go to the pros that UK hadn't been sending there before.
And then Fran mixed up his coaching staff.
The Perry Moss deal.
That's what I started to say. He brings in Perry Moss. Great credentials, but none of the coaches could get along with him. And that caused to me, that was the disruption of the Fran Kersey.
And then he came back only because Derek Ramsey said, if you don't bring him back, I'm leaving.
Yeah.
And that's when they had the 2 big years.
Yeah. So, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
How good was Charlie Bailey?
Charlie Bailey was a great defensive coach. He was. You talk about geniuses. Mm-hmm. I thought Charlie Bailey was a brilliant defensive coach.
And his first offensive coordinator was the guy that ended up at Arizona and Ohio State.
David. My mind just went. But
Yeah.
I got a picture of him in my mind.
Yeah.
Alex Gibbs.
No.
Alex Gibbs did the same thing.
Yes.
But David Adolph.
I'm
David
blanking
Adolph.
on it too. Cooper.
John Cooper.
John Cooper.
John Cooper, who was really, he married Helen from down there just north of Knoxville, Tennessee. And John Cooper was outstanding at Ohio State. He called me one time. He said, "Ralph, if you think the Kentucky basketball fans are crazy, you ought to meet the Ohio State football fans." He said,
and I mean, he just had an unbelievable
Yeah.
staff there. Charlie McCullers was a great coach that come in here.
Yeah.
I mean, that staff he had, they were just finding that uphill deal that they still are as being at the bottom of the league.
Yeah. And if Fran could have weathered the storm, I think that had been Kentucky in the modern era. I think that was Kentucky's best chance to turn the corner on football.
I think if Fran had been at a, quote, football school in the SEC, he would have been coaching for 25 years and would have gone down as one of the greatest of all. Because he was a great manager. And head coaches are CEOs. They don't act
Right.
X and O on the field.
Right.
They got to have 12 people underneath them to get the job done.
Yeah.
But after that, we go to bring home ex-alum Jerry Claiborne, who had been very, very successful in the ACC. But the ACC is no SEC.
They brought in Jerry. They had interviewed Roy Kidd, and they had interviewed Roy Kidd one other time.
Did they miss the boat on that?
They didn't feel, and I don't think I'm out of school of saying this because I've heard it from the mouths of the people. They didn't feel that Roy, being at Eastern, had the qualifications to come over and run a big-time program at University of Kentucky. Well, here's a man who had won championships. Here's a man who had taken one scholarship, split it 3 ways, got players in here to play. He had managed a lot of things to become a winner over at Eastern Kentucky. And I personally thought, as much as I grew to like Jerry, and he was my neighbor, next-door neighbor, is that he sat down on my porch one night and he said to me, "Raph, I hear you wasn't for me being the coach." And I said, "Well, that's not exactly right." He said, "I hear you for Roy Kidd." I said, "I was." I said, "You've had your chance at Virginia Tech and you had your chance at Maryland in the big time. I thought it was time that Coach Kidd had his chance, and this was a great opportunity for both UK and him." He sitting there eating a bowl of ice cream. He looked at me and says, "Well, you're right." We never said another word about it for the rest of the time that we knew Jerry.
Yeah.
Was about that. Like I say, there was one house in between me and him.
His second year, he had the biggest turnaround in college football. Went to a bowl game, 83, I think it was West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Then 84, they went back to the Hall of Fame in Birmingham and beat a really good Wisconsin team that had a great receiver by the name of Al Toon, who played many years in the NFL. At that point in time, it looked like things were beginning to come together.
It did, and I never really figured out why it didn't stay together.
I think Bill Ransdell was the quarterback in 84.
Yep. Jerry had a good staff, put together a good staff, brought them with him.
Bill Glazer's still here.
Yeah.
Started out under Kersey.
Yeah, and Terry Schrock did the defense.
Jerry Eisman.
Jerry Eisman. But he had a really good staff.
Did they just not recruit?
I think I started to say to you, I think the problem was they couldn't get the players.
Yeah.
That was the one thing. They couldn't get the players in here because all of those guys could coach. And Terry even ended up being on a national championship team coaching at Georgia Tech.
And his last year here, I think he ended up – he had several 6-5 years. By then, 6-5 didn't get you into a bowl necessarily. Right. And I think it was either his last year or next to last year, the SEC went to 7 league games instead of 6, which meant that there was another loss line there.
That's right. Anytime you add another Southeastern Conference game to the schedule, it is not to Kentucky's favor. And maybe that will change, but it's still that way. You add another one, it's still – they didn't add Missouri and South Carolina to the league for basketball.
Right.
They added them for football.
Right. And then Curry comes in, and either his first or second year, they had an 8th league game to it.
Yep.
And, of course, what do you remember about the hiring process of Curry? Because Sim has just come on board the year before that.
Right. And I think that was the second time that Roy was interviewed.
Yes, that is correct.
He was interviewed there for that particular thing. what I remember, and I could remember this all wrong, but I'll tell you what I remember. There was a guy who worked for Kentucky Central. He was a crazy Alabama fan. And every time he'd come by my office, he would come in and he would just raise Cain about Bill Curry being the head coach of the University of Alabama. And I said to him, "You're going to the Sugar Bowl." Howard was his name. I said, "You're going to the Sugar Bowl, Howard. This man's done a great job at the University of Alabama." "Hey, he's not one of our boys. He's not one of our boys." I said, "Surely you don't feel that way." He said, "That's the way we all feel in Alabama." So CM, I knew that, look for a coach. I called Larry Ivy. And I said, "Ivy, I got the craziest idea I've ever had." And he said, "What's that?" And he said, I said, "Have CM talk to Bill Curry." "You're crazy. He's at Alabama." Of course, Larry's an Alabama man. I said, "Larry, I'm just telling you, check with your Alabama buddies and see what they say." And we talked a few minutes more. Next thing I know, Larry calls me back. And he said, "I told CM what you said." He said, "CM said you was crazy." I said, "Yeah, I know that. I just threw it out as a crazy idea. I come up with those at the time." That night or the next day, Larry called me back. He said, "Ralph, don't say anything about this, but CM's got a meeting with Bill Curry." I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No." So shortly after that, I get a call from Larry. He said, "Don't say anything about it, but we're hiring Curry." Now that
the thing I remember back shortly after that is the people in Alabama apparently didn't like him. First of all, they resented the fact that Alabama would hire a Georgia Tech guy because they hated Georgia Tech and the coach down there at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he didn't beat Auburn, and it's just a matter of time because his last game there, if things had worked out right, he could have been a national champion that year.
That's
Notre
right.
Dame won it.
That's right.
But if they had won their bowl game, and that was the famous game where during that era, Curry got a lot of props because he jerked a kid on the sideline that had done something stupid on the field and read him the riot act with a TV camera on him and sent him to the bench. And, of course, again, during that era, you got props for that. Today you can't do that. And, I think Sam did a sales job on the fact that made Curry think, hey, you can do it anywhere. And Curry never had an ideal. I don't think he understood, no matter where you're Steve Spurrier or whoever, and there's a good example, that you can be the greatest recruiter in the world, but if you're at a bad school, forget it. Spurrier could recruit kids to Florida. He wasn't able to recruit those same kids to South Carolina. That's a big difference.
Yep.
But anyway, Curry comes here. All of a sudden, they can't sell tickets in his third year here. And see him sweating it. The attendance is falling off. So he calls up Louisville, Bill Olson, agrees to a game with Kentucky and Louisville. Now, I ask you the same question you talked about on the basketball side. Was that a good move?
No. Same reason. Political. It gave Louisville too much standing in Frankfurt in the legislature when it came to get money.
And the ironic thing is before they actually ever played the game in 93, they win 6 games and go to a bowl, Peach Bowl.
Mm-hmm.
And they wouldn't need to. And it goes along, and then we got to go to 96 when things are starting to fall apart, and they're able to recruit a kid by the name of Tim Couch who at a point in time wanted to go to Tennessee and follow Peyton Manning, but he does come here. And then you've got Bill Curry, who has hired an offensive coordinator from his real good friend Bill McCartney at Colorado, who had just retired. Said this is a great offensive coordinator, but if you take him, you got to let him do what he wants to do. And they brought in
Elliot Uzelak,
and Tim Couch was running the option.
Well, I can remember when they were recruiting Tim Couch. Is that I got a call from Bill, and he said, if you were recruiting Tim Couch, what would you do?
Now, this is Bill Curry talking to you.
Talking to me. And I said, I would get a hold of Oscar and I'd get a hold of Joe B. They're going down to his football game this week. He's a crazy University of Kentucky basketball fan. Tim Couch is. I didn't know Tim at the time. I said I would get a hold of Oscar, and I'd get a hold of Joe B., and I'd see if I could ride down there to the ball game with them. And he said, what? And I went over it again. And I said, I know that last week he was up here, and what he wanted to do when he was up here, he wanted to meet Sam Bowie.
Mm-hmm.
And they met him at Wheeler's Drugstore.
He's got a 8x10 picture of him being at camp with Sam Bowie when he was like 6, 7, 8 years old.
So anyway, I don't know whether he ever called you. I don't know but I think all of you ended up in that stadium that night.
He did call me, but it was illegal for me or him to go with me or me to go with him.
Okay.
But we did meet at Leicester County High School around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It was on a Friday. It was during the Mary Breckenridge Festival that they have each year, like a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and it was being held at the Richard Nixon Gymnasium that had just been built. So we're going in there, just walking around all these arts and crafts and everything. And this is a short story. He walks in and there's a barrel with a whole bunch of sticks in it, all 4.5 feet. This, it looked like snake sticks and everything like that. And Bill's sort of infatuated with, arts and crafts and all that kind of stuff. He said, what's this right here? And this old guy said, it's a whooping stick. He said, what? He said, it's a whooping stick. He said, well, what's a whooping stick? He said, if you don't know what whooping stick is, you don't need to be here. But anyway, long story short, he bought 3 whooping sticks. He was going to take it back to the staff.
Yeah.
So he was there that night, and that was the night that Tennessee showed up in 2 stretch orange limos and parked right up on the field. I think they were playing Belfry that night, if I remember correctly. But anyway, he was there that night, and, as that went along, but going back again, one of the key people in Tim Couch coming to Kentucky, as far as former players recruiting, was a guy named Talbot Todd.
Yeah.
And if it hadn't been for those guys, I don't know where he came here, because I don't think that Tim or his father, either one, were ever comfortable with Curry, and particularly Uselak.
Elliot Uselak, I'd sat in too many meetings over there. And Elliot Uselak, who was a nice fellow, never thought that Tim Couch could play it. He hated the fact that Tim could throw the football because Elliot was a running quarterback, offensive coach.
Trying to mix oil and water.
Right. And he just absolutely, every time Bill would suggest that they're going to play Tim, Elliot Uselak would just have a hissy fit. And it was unbelievable. And this is back when I'd go over there every day, and I would jog with the coaches. I was in the locker room. I mean, I was like another coach, And I said a lot of things I can't tell because of being so close to them. But
well, in Tim's freshman year, which would have been '96, they got off sort of a poor start. Somebody beat them the second game of the season, and then went to Cincinnati, and it was spitting snow, and they were down bad early in the third quarter, to the point that Tim's parents and family left at the end of the third quarter to go home to watch his brother play at Eastern that night. And I think he may have got in for a series, but then the radio shows and everything were just lighting it up on them. He went to Florida, and he started Florida. What do you remember about that game?
Really, I don't.
You don't?
Yeah.
I mean, it was 71-0.
Yeah.
And I remember going to the locker room after the game, and the players were walking in that little dirt way at Florida Field. And usually I could pull the quarterbacks over to the side, and it was just reading them the riot act, all 5 of them. Don't know what he said, but it wasn't pretty. And it looked like that pretty much was the end of it.
Well, they treated Tim in a bad way. They just treated him terribly as far as being a player.
Now, you had to be involved because, again, you're all still doing the radio and TV and all that. Tell me the best of your recollection of how Hal Mummy ended up being the next coach?
Talbot, Talbot Todd, you brought him up. Talbot Todd and Larry Ivy. Is it Talbot? I think it was Talbot who had heard about Hal Mummy.
Is it true that at one point Mike Gottfried was named the coach? And
I don't know he was named. I know that.
Well, I mean, not publicly, but
I know that there were some people who tried to get Mike Gottfried,
and that he got shot down by one of the people that claimed that he had some negative stuff at Pittsburgh.
That was the reason that it didn't happen, to my knowledge. And then they had to go start all over again. And to my knowledge, it was Talbot who came up with the name of Hal Mummy, and I believe he and Larry flew down to Valdosta, Georgia.
Well, I know they flew to Carson Newman and watched the last game he coached in a playoff.
Well, that could very well be where they went. I just knew they took down there. And the next thing we know, we're in Alaska, I think, for the Great Alaska Shootout. And I remember I either walked in to do the pregame show with Rick, or somehow Rick and I were together, and he said, "Well, did you hear about hiring a football coach?" And I said, "No." He says, "I can't believe they didn't even call to tell me in advance who it was." And I said, "Who was it?" And he said, "Somebody named Mummy or something like that." He said, "I never heard of him." And they kept it so quiet that nearly nobody knew about it.
I'd got to know Mike Gottfried a little bit a few years earlier because he'd had a relationship with Patino. And Mike had called me, he coached at Moorhead one time.
Yeah.
And when he called me, he said he was in the mix for us. He called me on a Saturday night and said, "Hey, I'm going to be the new coach, going to be named Monday."
Yeah.
He said, "I'll be in town tomorrow night. Would you come have dinner with me at the Hyde?"
Yeah.
Next morning, I got a phone call back and said it's all off. Couldn't speak.
I'd heard the same thing.
Best team you covered, Kentucky football?
Oh, it had to be, the 76-77 team that I covered. They were outstanding. They were good or better than anybody else in the SEC. They were like an Alabama or LSU.
Your favorite UK players to cover?
Oh, I don't know. There were so many of them. Again, there were so many on that team. I remember Bubba McCullum was one of my favorite people. I just loved Bubba McCullum. I liked Elmore Stevens, Mike Ranieri, and I liked Derek Ramsey and Warren Bryant and Art Still. I like people who you never heard of, like Doug Vesio. All of those guys. I liked, I'd go stand on the side of the field, and I was about the only guy they allowed to come to every practice, and I went to every practice I think nearly they had during all those coaches.
So, I pretty much after the Mummy era, and Brooks, you've been away from it now, but how do you see the program as it stands today and into the immediate future?
I don't know. I keep thinking, like everybody else, preseason, I keep thinking, boy, we're gonna do it this year. We're gonna go 7-4. We're gonna go 8-3. We're gonna do that. Then somewhere along the line, we'll step on it, and something will happen, and we'll start to spiral downward. And it's always, I remember going back, and even back in the early days of say, John Ray and of Fran Kersey, we would have, of the 22 players on the field, we'd have probably 16 that could play anywhere. But you let one of those key players get hurt, we had nobody to put in there for them.
In other words, you could survive even a great buoy going to the sidelines.
Right.
But you couldn't survive with a great buoy in football going to the sidelines.
Could not. You don't have anybody to put in there for them. When Sonny Collins went down, when he was here, we had nobody to put in there, to replace Sonny Collins, who could run like Sonny Collins. We didn't have that. It's always been that situation. If Mike Vanuzzi got hurt, who are we going to put in there to play quarterback? We didn't have anybody to put in there to play quarterback. We'd, be lucky if we went down and got a linebacker to play quarterback. And it's always been that. So we haven't been in the position at the University of Kentucky to stockpile. Is that we haven't been in a position to have somebody to back up a starter when they got hurt of quality.
You think they're any closer to that today than they have been?
Well, if you read the releases, they're going to be beating the New York Giants or the Green Bay Packers. But it all goes. What happens if you get out there on the practice field today and you're going full steam and bang, one goes down? How are you going to replace him? We won't know until it happens. It takes a great deal of luck and a great deal of skill. And I hope that it happens. I really hope that it happens because I enjoy watching UK football.
One last question. What do you see the direction of UK athletics and Mitch Barnhart currently going forward?
The direction?
Yeah.
He's been a good administrator. He's been an aggressive administrator about adding programs, adding people, adding things, and I guess he came at the right time, again, right place, right time, right person. You come in there, and at the same time, just about he came in here, that's when the NCAA started getting a lot more money into the Final Four, for basketball, and which you could use once you get into the school, wherever you want to use it, it's my understanding. You started getting the College World Series on television, more money coming into the school. You started getting the Southeastern Conference Network came along, added all that money into it. So it's like all of a sudden you've struggled along and you've done this and you've done the very, very best you can with what you have, and you have all these ideas, and all of a sudden you say, oh my God, I just hit Powerball. And I think that's where Mitch is that Mitch has taken the money that they have had and that they have gotten, and he has invested it wisely. And I think he's done a nice job with it. But every time he invests something, remember this, ladies and gentlemen, if he invests $1, Alabama invested $1, and they were already $10 ahead of us. So it takes, no matter what Mitch is doing, and as hard as he is working and trying to get it done, it's still climbing that ladder straight up.
And there's people climbing the ladder on the left and right of you.
On the left and right of you. So somewhere along the way, he's got to get a break. He got a break with his baseball team, a few years ago. Now he's got to get a break now with the with the football. If he gets a break with football, that's the big break. That's really hitting the Powerball right there.
You ever dream that the revenue would come about in the fashion it has?
Oh my God, I never thought about being that kind of revenue. It's unbelievable. And I have, sometimes I got to be honest with you, I have time, not just Kentucky now, don't get me in that corner, but all the money that they put into athletics. All the money they put into athletics. Yeah, they say, the athletics brings it in, that's why they're doing it. Yes, they do. But I think that there needs to sometime be a study done, and I'm not big on studies. Let's just say you had a bunch of people sit around a table and say, we could use, of that $20 million you're spending here, we could use $1 million here to put into this department, and $1 million here to put in this department, $1 million to put in this department. We could do that, and you still have $10 million left over. Could you not use that $10 million and give the university $10 million to do something with? Where's it all going? Now we've gotten out of the privatization of dorms, privatization of the restaurants on campus, not just here, everywhere. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the way that it goes, and maybe that's the way they get it. Things change. And I think Mitch has done a good job. The bottom line is I think Mitch has done a good job. I think he's done a really good job. But we had other athletic directors in Kentucky they didn't have the funds to do what he's done. But he's had the cojones that once that money got there, he's had the cojones to do it.
Did Cliff Hagan get a bum rap?
Oh, of course. Never met a more honest guy in my life than Cliff Hagan. If Cliff Hagan told you something, of course, you're going to go put it down, have your lawyer write it down. Whatever Cliff told you on a deal, that's the way it's going to be. But yeah, Cliff got a bum rap.
Ralph, appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Always great.
My pleasure.
I'm buying.
I'll believe that when I see it.
All right, thanks to Ralph Hacker, who took the time to sit down with Oscar. We'll hear more from Ralph down the road as Part 2 and Part 3 will be released in the future. But as for now, the best way to get all of Oscar's podcast is to subscribe. To have conversations with Oscar Combs downloaded to your mobile device, just search for @Wildcat News in the iTunes Store or in the Google Play Store under Podcast and subscribe. That way you're guaranteed not to miss an episode, and you can do it the old-fashioned way. Just go to OscarCombs.com and select the podcast page, and all of Oscar's podcasts will be ready for your listening enjoyment. Make sure you catch Oscar on Twitter. He's at Wildcat News. In the coming month, Oscar and I will be releasing some unique podcasts that you're not going to find anywhere else. And we're going to have some fun reliving over 50 years of Wildcat memories with Oscar. So I suggest you subscribe and follow. It's easy. Subscribe and follow. I'm Bo Robinson, and thanks for listening to Conversations with Oscar Combs. And as always, go Big Blue.